It begins with chaos. The streets of Kathmandu erupt in sound as thousands of young voices chant in unison, fists raised high. Police lines buckle under the pressure, tear gas drifts through the neon-lit alleys, but the crowd refuses to scatter. In the middle of the smoke, a teenager holds a handmade sign with two words, "No more." Hours later, the Prime Minister's residence trembles, not from an earthquake, but from the force of a generation no longer willing to stay silent. What could drive an entire nation's youth to risk everything, facing batons and bullets, in a battle against corruption and control? It began quietly, as revolutions often do. A string of scandals erupted in Nepal's government: nepotism, inflated contracts, secret deals siphoning wealth away from ordinary citizens. But the final spark wasn't money. It was freedom. When the government moved to restrict social media platforms, claiming it was to protect stability, young people saw it as a direct attack. For Gen Z, raised on TikTok, Instagram, and digital freedom, this wasn't just policy, it was personal. Overnight, students, coders, bloggers, and even school kids flooded the streets. The authorities expected small rallies. Instead, they faced an unstoppable tide. At the front were teenagers who had never known life without the internet. How did protests over apps and memes transform into a movement that threatened the entire political order? Nepal's youth are unlike any that came before. Born after the country's civil war, they inherited the promises of democracy, but saw little of its benefits. Jobs were scarce, corruption was rampant, and leaders treated power like a family inheritance. Yet Gen Z wasn't shaped by dusty halls of politics. They were shaped by global culture, memes, music, and movements spreading across screens at light speed. They knew what young people in Hong Kong, Chile, and Tunisia had done when their voices were ignored. So when the government tried to cut their digital lifeline, it struck at the very core of their identity. Overnight, hashtags became battle cries. Protest songs spread faster than propaganda. Still, noise alone doesn't topple systems. For survival, the movement had to become more than rallies. It had to grow into an idea too big to crush. For decades, corruption in Nepal was background noise, frustrating but constant. Politicians enriched themselves while citizens endured crumbling roads, power cuts, and poor health care. But when censorship collided with corruption, it created a storm. Young people weren't only angry about stolen money, they were furious at having their voices stolen. Protest camps sprang up across Kathmandu. Students painted murals on cracked walls, chains breaking, eyes staring through blindfolds. The government responded with riot police, curfews, and arrests, but each crackdown only fueled the fire. Videos of students beaten in the streets went viral before censors could stop them. Every baton swing recruited more to the cause, and soon the protests weren't just about apps or bans. They were about the very legitimacy of power itself. But could unarmed youth truly topple a system rooted in decades of corruption? The turning point came when thousands of high school students joined university graduates and unemployed workers. It wasn't just activists anymore. It was children of shopkeepers, farmers, and laborers. The scale was impossible to contain. City squares became rivers of humanity. From rural towns to mountain valleys, caravans of buses carried protesters to the capital. And then came a moment no one could erase. Security forces fired live rounds into the crowd. Young protesters fell. Images of blood on snow-covered streets spread across the internet despite bans. International media picked up the story. Pressure mounted. Behind closed doors, power brokers whispered, "What happens if we lose control completely?" Within weeks, the Prime Minister faced resignations inside his own circle. The cracks widened. But revolutions don't end when leaders step down. They face a deeper question: what comes after victory? Against all odds, Nepal's Gen Z protests didn't just shake the streets, they shook the government itself. The Prime Minister was forced to resign. For the first time in the nation's history, a female prime minister was appointed, symbolizing a break from the past. The youth demanded change, and they got it. But revolutions are never neat. Challenges remained: how to rebuild institutions, how to prevent corruption from reappearing in new forms, how to turn raw energy into sustainable reform. Yet one fact was undeniable. The youth had rewritten what was possible. A generation that once felt voiceless had proven its strength. But here lies the hardest question. Can the fire of the streets survive once it enters the halls of government? What happened in Nepal didn't stay in Nepal. Across the world, young people watched the footage. In Africa, Latin America, and Eastern Europe, Student leaders cited Nepal as proof that youth movements could succeed, even against entrenched corruption. Social media, once targeted for suppression, became the very channel that spread the story globally. The irony was clear. The attempt to silence created a voice louder than ever. Analysts began asking, are we witnessing a new wave of Gen Z uprisings? Could this be the start of a generational revolt against corruption worldwide? Because if the smallest of nations could rewrite its destiny through youth power, what might happen when larger ones ignite? In the cold nights of Kathmandu, where tear gas once choked the air, silence now carries a different meaning. It's the silence after a storm, the pause before the next struggle. Nepal's Gen Z uprising was not just a protest, it was proof that corruption, no matter how deep, is not invincible. That censorship, no matter how strict, cannot suppress the need for voice. For a generation often dismissed as distracted or disconnected, they proved the opposite. They proved that in the age of memes and hashtags, courage still means stepping into the street and risking everything for the chance at something better. The future of Nepal is uncertain, but one truth is clear: when a generation refuses silence, even the oldest systems must listen.